Picture this. The music world thought it knew everything about Abba's golden star, Agnetha. The flawless blonde voice, the sparkling smile, the perfect image that never cracked. But in a few sentences, Elvis Costello shattered decades of illusion. During a live interview, he dropped a confession so raw, so unexpected, it sent shockwaves rippling across the industry. It wasn't just a jab at pop royalty. It was a revelation of something darker, something that had always been hiding in plain sight. Because behind the crystal-clear melodies and glittering stage lights was a story of conflict, betrayal, and fear. A story the world was never meant to hear. The late 1970s were a battlefield of sound. On one side, Abba stood as untouchable pop royalty, selling out stadiums and dominating the charts with glitter, harmonies, and a carefully polished image that looked almost too perfect to break. On the other side was Elvis Costello, sharp-tongued, unapologetic, and the face of a punk movement that lived to tear down exactly what Abba represented. These two universes seemed galaxies apart, and no one could have imagined they'd ever cross paths. Yet in 1979, at a smoky London industry party, they did. The atmosphere that night was heavy with champagne and ego. Under the chandelier's glow, deals were struck, alliances tested, and careers shaped in whispers. That's when Costello and Agnetha found themselves face to face. At first, their exchange was nothing more than polite chatter. But Costello wasn't known for keeping things polite for long. Witnesses recall his smirk, followed by a remark that sliced through the room like broken glass. He accused Abba of being nothing more than a corporate machine, and Agnetha its puppet. The party fell silent. Eyes shifted. For a moment, Agnetha froze, pale and stunned. And then she snapped. Her voice rose, her words sharp enough to rattle the walls, though no one could ever agree on exactly what she shouted. All they remember is the tension that turned nuclear in seconds. Agnetha stormed out, and Costello, true to form, stayed behind, unbothered. The fallout from that night didn't end when the party did. Costello later admitted the bitterness lingered for decades, fueled not only by the clash, but by something he claimed to have seen in Agnetha's eyes, fragility hidden behind icy control. For her, it was a wound that cut deeper than anyone realized, and it was only the beginning of much darker battles to come. For millions of fans, Agnetha was the shining face of Abba. Flawless on stage, effortless in interviews, and untouchable in reputation. But the music industry whispered a very different story. Behind the lights and rehearsed smiles, she was clashing with producers, managers, and even fellow artists in ways that few outsiders ever saw. When Abba slowed down and Agnetha moved into her solo career, the cracks widened. She was determined to take full creative control, but that determination often spiraled into tension. Recording sessions that should have been exciting instead turned into battlefields. Producers spoke in hushed tones about her perfectionism, her refusal to compromise, and her fiery insistence that nothing leave the studio unless it matched the vision in her head. Some walked away in tears, others swore they would never work with her again. And then, there were the collaborations that never happened. Rumors swirled about a potential duet with Phil Collins, a move that could have cemented her as an international solo powerhouse. But according to insiders, she shut it down, claiming she didn't want to share the spotlight. To some, it looked like bold independence. To others, it looked like arrogance, even paranoia. Swedish artists who crossed her path described her as cold, dismissive, and at times emotionally unstable. The contrast was jarring. On stage, Agnetha radiated warmth and beauty, yet behind closed doors she was fighting with almost everyone around her. It wasn't the picture-perfect star the public thought they knew. It was someone battling for control over her music, her image, and maybe even her sanity. But the struggle didn't stop there. Because years later, when the world thought her silence was finally broken with a long-awaited comeback, what unfolded would leave the industry stunned once again. For years, fans begged for Agnetha to return, and in 2004, it finally looked like their prayers had been answered. After more than a decade of near silence, she announced a new record, My Coloring Book. The hype was enormous. Magazines hailed it as the comeback of the decade. Radio stations lined up for exclusive plays, and a European promotional tour was promised. For a moment, it seemed like Agnetha was ready to reclaim her throne. But almost as quickly as it began, the dream unraveled. After just a handful of appearances, she vanished. Interviews were cancelled, press tours evaporated. The carefully planned promotional machine screeched to a halt, leaving record executives scrambling and furious. Millions had been poured into the project, and now their star had walked away without explanation. Behind the scenes, the whispers were far darker than the polished statements issued to the press. Some insiders claimed she suffered panic attacks before stepping on stage, collapsing backstage in tears. Others said she locked herself in hotel rooms, refusing to answer knocks on the door. There were reports of shouting matches with managers and threats to tear up contracts if she was forced to continue. The label painted it as exhaustion. Those closer to her called it a meltdown. What the public saw was a cancelled tour. What the industry saw was a woman unraveling again. For fans, the sudden disappearance was confusing. For Agnetha, it was survival. The pressure to smile, sing, and act as if nothing was wrong was too much to bear. And this wasn't the first time her private battles collided with public expectations. Because long before the failed comeback, Agnetha had been fighting struggles even closer to home, battles that began inside Abba itself. At the height of Abba's fame, the stage glittered with sequins and smiles, but behind the curtain, the cracks were already showing. For Agnetha, the biggest fracture wasn't in the music, it was in her marriage. Her relationship with Björn Ulvaeus, the man who wrote some of the group's most iconic love songs, had collapsed in a very public divorce. And yet, night after night, she stood just feet away from him, performing songs about heartbreak as if nothing was wrong. The tension was suffocating. Fans saw two former lovers harmonizing beautifully under the lights. What they didn't see was the icy silence backstage, the forced conversations, and the strain of turning private pain into a public performance. Benny and Annie Frid tried to keep the group moving forward, but the air around Agnetha grew heavier with each passing tour. Her fear of flying only made matters worse. Promotional schedules required constant travel, but Agnetha often refused to board planes. She missed appearances, skipped recording sessions, and left managers scrambling to cover her absence. To outsiders, it looked like diva behavior. To those closer, it was a woman consumed by anxiety, desperate for control in a life that felt like it was spinning away from her. By the early 1980s, the emotional toll was undeniable. Agnetha was caught between two worlds, the demands of superstardom and the pull of motherhood. In rare interviews, she admitted the guilt that haunted her every time she left home, describing how her daughter would cry at the window while she boarded flights for another tour. She cried too, but in silence, thousands of feet above the ground. The world saw a pop icon, but behind that golden smile was a mother, torn apart by choices no chart-topping single could ever fix. By 1982, the fairy tale of Abba had begun to crumble, and with it, so did Agnetha's grip on the life she once knew. Rumors swirled through Stockholm's media circles about breakdowns, paranoia, and long days spent locked away in silence. Friends whispered that she had grown terrified of public life, that the very spotlight which once made her shine had become unbearable. When the band unofficially split, Agnetha didn't just step away, she disappeared. While Benny and Björn pursued new musical projects, and Annie Frid kept a cautious presence in the spotlight, Agnetha vanished into the Swedish countryside. She chose quiet roads, tall trees, and heavy gates over cameras, concerts, and chaos. The world believed she had retired peacefully. In reality, her retreat was less about peace and more about escape. But isolation didn't shield her from the relentless press. Paparazzi camped outside her estate, hungry for a glimpse of the reclusive star. Headlines painted her as eccentric, unstable, or broken. And just when she thought she had found safety and distance, betrayal struck in the cruelest way. In the early 1990s, Agnetha entered a relationship with Detective Torbjörn Brander, a man she believed she could trust. Instead, her private moments were sold to the tabloids, photos, stories, even intimate details splashed across pages for the world to devour. It was a violation that left her humiliated and heartbroken. For Agnetha, it wasn't just a breakup, it was the shattering of whatever fragile trust she had left. So she closed the doors tighter. Calls went unanswered. Appearances stopped altogether. For fans, it looked like a mystery. For Agnetha, it was survival. Yet even behind walls and distance, an even darker threat was already on its way, one she could neither predict nor escape. Just when Agnetha thought she had found refuge in isolation, her world turned into something far darker. It began innocently enough, a fan who sent letters, flowers, and gifts. At first it seemed harmless, the kind of attention any global star might expect. But then the tone shifted. The fan, a man named Gert van der Graaf, wasn't content to admire her from a distance. His admiration twisted into something obsessive, and soon Agnetha found herself being followed. He moved near her countryside home. He appeared in the places she thought were safe. Letters turned from affectionate to unsettling, laced with delusion and promises that made her skin crawl. When she pulled away, he pressed harder. When she called the police, he came back. Even when restraining orders were issued, he reappeared like a shadow she couldn't escape. Her sanctuary began to feel like a prison. Friends said she started pacing at night, checking locks twice, sometimes 3 times. She left lights burning until dawn, terrified of the dark corners of her own house. The home she had built as a shield from the world became a cage, and she was its prisoner. Imagine being adored by millions, yet afraid to open your front door. For Agnetha, this wasn't just paranoia, it was reality. Her stalker's presence was relentless, stripping her of peace and deepening her withdrawal from the outside world. The gates grew taller, the walls thicker, the distance between her and the public wider than ever. By the time the headlines caught on, the damage was already done. Agnetha, once the golden girl of pop, was now a recluse, hunted by fear. And while the world speculated about her absence, very few understood the truth. She was fighting a battle that fame could never protect her from. By the late 2000s, Agnetha's silence was deafening. No reunions, no red carpets, no surprise appearances, nothing. For the outside world, her absence was a mystery wrapped in speculation. But for those who knew her best, it was the only way she could survive. Behind locked doors and heavy curtains, she battled panic attacks that left her gasping for breath. Nights were long, filled with tears no one saw. Even family members admitted that at times they were kept at a distance. The woman who once sang to millions could barely bring herself to speak to strangers. And yet, ironically, the further she withdrew, the brighter her legend became. Fans clung desperately to the image of the golden-haired star they remembered. Letters poured in, drawings, poems, even flowers left outside her estate. Some camped out for days, hoping for a fleeting glimpse of the woman who had disappeared. But the truth was far from romantic. This wasn't a diva retreating out of pride. It was a human being retreating out of pain. Then came the moment no one expected. In 2025, Elvis Costello's interview reopened wounds the world thought had healed. His blunt confession didn't just throw shade, it ripped the curtain off decades of carefully maintained illusion. In a few words, he revealed what insiders had long whispered. Behind the flawless image was a woman locked in a war with herself. The breakdowns, the disappearances, the paranoia. Suddenly, it all made sense. For some fans, his words were shocking. For others, they were confirmation of what they had always suspected. Agnetha wasn't just a pop icon. She was a survivor of a fairy tale that had slowly turned into a nightmare. And unlike the songs, this story never found a happy ending.